Alright, so in this video we're going to talk about the charge phase, and this is exciting because we're actually going to start talking about how each of the phases of the game work now, and really start getting into pushing some models around. I'm going to go through a few slides here, and then we're going to actually get on the table, and I'll show you how everything interacts. So the charge phase, the first thing we're going to go over is just declaring charges and then the reactions. We'll talk about redirecting the charge, moving the chargers, maximizing your contact, what's going to happen when you have combined charges, and then a failed charge. And I do want to point out that charging is the only way that you can get into close combat with another unit, so this is a very important part of the game. Alright, so the charge phase sequence, this is where you start each turn. Nothing happens before you declare charges in each player turn. So what will happen is the start of the charge phase is the start of the player turn. Then the active player is going to choose a unit and they're going to declare a charge. Then the reactive player is basically going to say what their charge reaction is and then go ahead and complete whatever that's going to be. You're going to repeat those two steps until everybody that wants to charge has gone ahead and declared their charge, and then you've had the reaction to the charge. So the active player then chooses a unit that declared a charge and then rolls for the charge range, and then he moves that unit. And then you're just going to repeat this step until everybody that has declared a charge has moved. And then that's going to be the end of the charge phase. So when you declare charges, you're basically going to pick a unit that isn't already charging, it's not fleeing, and it doesn't have any shaken models. And then what that unit's going to do is it's going to say, I'm going to charge this specific unit. Now one model in that unit has to be able to draw a line of sight to the unit that they want to charge, and that does include their whole boundary there. The other thing you got to make sure is that the charged unit is within the maximum potential charge of the unit. So for example, if the unit moves 5, then if you take 5 plus 12, the unit needs to be within it at least 17 inches or closer to the unit, otherwise they just cannot charge it. And the last thing, you need to make sure there's enough room for the charging unit to actually move into base contact with the charged unit. Now when you're determining if there's enough room, you are going to take into account any already declared charges, and that's going to include the alignment moves of the charging and the charge units. You won't take into account any potential flee charge reactions, unless it's a mandatory one. So if you're already fleeing, you do have to automatically flee. And you're not going to take into account any potential casualties inflicted to the charging unit, by say a stand and shoot or dangerous terrain or something like that. And also don't take into account any potential combat reforms due to a blocked path. And these will make more sense when I get the models out and we show you how all these work. As when you're being charged, you have 3 different charge reactions. The first one is going to be hold, and that just means the charge unit does nothing, they're just going to stand there. Now I will tell you, if you're already in combat, or if you're shaken, then the only thing that you can do is just hold. For a stand and shoot, you need to make sure a couple of things are met before you can actually declare this as a charge reaction. The first thing, you need to make sure that the unit can actually perform shooting attacks. Next, the charging unit has to be located in the charged unit's front arc. If they're not in the front arc, then you can't stand and shoot against them. And then the last one is the charging unit has to be farther away than its advance rate. So basically what that's saying is if the unit's too close, the unit that's being charged just does not have time to actually get their weapons out, shooting weapons, and then actually fire. So if the advance rate is 4, then as long as they're farther than 4 away, you're fine. On cavalry, sometimes you see 9 or 10, and if they're within that, then you just can't do a stand and shoot. So a couple of things I want to point out is, even if the unit that is charging the unit is farther than the weapon's maximum range, so you have a pistol that's range 12 and they're charging from 17 inches away, you can still stand and shoot. You're just going to be at long range. And you're always going to want to take the range modifier into account, as well as if you have a stand and shoot penalty with your army, you want to take that into account when you're figuring out what it takes to hit. Now your last option is to flee. So when you flee, you're immediately going to pivot the unit to face directly away from the charging enemy, and we do this from center to center of each of the units. And then you're going to make a flee move, which is 2d6. Sometimes it's 3d6, taking the highest. And you're going to go ahead and move that unit as far as they roll the dice on the flee. Now, once a unit declares a flee reaction, then the charging unit can choose to attempt to redirect the charge. And I'll talk about that in just a second. Now, if the fleeing unit front-facing comes into contact with any unit that declared a charge against it, then they're automatically removed as a casualty. And the other thing is, if a unit is fleeing when it's charged, then the only thing they can choose is to flee, and they're going to just flee again from that charge. And another thing, if a unit is fleeing when it's charged, then the only thing they can do is declare a flee charge reaction. So it will go ahead and flee, even if it is fleeing, again from whatever the charge is. All right, so when a unit flees, as a charger, you can choose to redirect the charge if you pass a discipline test. So you just need to pass the discipline test. So if you do pass the discipline test, then you can declare a new charge against another viable enemy target. One thing I want to point out is units can only attempt to redirect a charge once per player turn. So if you charge, someone flees, and then you say, I'm redirecting, you pass the redirect, you charge again, and they flee. Now, your choices are to go against one of those units. You don't have to pass on the redirect test to choose which unit you go ahead and charge. But if they both end up out of your potential charge range, then that is going to be a failed charge because you can't choose to redirect into another unit. So when we go to move the chargers, we're going to take into account the charge range, the charge move, aligning the units, and then maximizing contact. And what's going to be easiest if we go ahead and get some models on the board, and I'll show you how to do all of this now. All right, so let's talk about the basics of a charge. This is going to be a real simple charge, and we'll get into more complex situations here in a little bit. So these feral orcs are going to charge the dwarf warriors over here. And the first thing we want to do is see how far it is for them to charge. So if I put my tape measure up here and I go from model to model, and you always go to the closest to closest. So we would never go like this because that's farther away. And even if there was something in between the two of these, we would still measure from closest to closest. And we're going to see that is just a little over 10 inches, which means that automatically makes it an 11-inch charge. We always go on the even numbers on that. So even if you're an 1/8 inch over 10, it's automatically 11. And if you're just a little under 10, it doesn't matter, you're still going to be 10. All right, so we know that orcs go 4 inches, and we know that it's over 10, so it's going to be an 11-inch charge for them. So what they're going to need to do is roll 2 dice, and their advance rate plus the dice needs to equal 11. So they essentially need to get a 7 on the dice. All right, so when I go ahead and roll this, we're going to roll, and that is a 5. So that means they failed their charge, and what's going to happen is they're going to move forward 4 inches because they're going to go the highest amount, the highest dice, and they're going to ignore this one. Now, they wouldn't move straight forward because they do need to go straight towards them, so they'd wheel a little bit and then move towards them. But let's say that they went ahead and rolled an 8 here. So that would give them enough to go ahead and make the charge. So there's a couple of ways that you can move when you're charging. And let me move these dice out of the way. You can go forward as much as you want, unlimited. And again, even if you're going around something, again, as long as you're going straight forward, you can go as much as you want. And then, so as we come up like this, let's just move them like this. At some point, this is going to need to wheel to maximize. So they can start wheeling. So how we wheel is we're going to hold this down, this corner, and we're going to wheel, wheel, wheel. And then we're going to go ahead and go forward. Now, once we touch, then this is called aligning. And what we're going to do is we're just going to bring these together. Now, you can only wheel one time while you're charging. So the aligning here is not considered a wheel because we've made contact, and now we're just going to go ahead and align. So let's say you wanted to wheel this way and then go forward. You couldn't then turn and wheel here to come in. You always have to do, again, just the one wheel. And then the other thing with wheeling is you can't go more than 90 degrees. So say these guys were here, then the most that they can wheel is to here. They can't continue wheeling around like this. So once they reached here, then they would just go forward. All right, now there's some basic rules when you're maximizing contact. The first thing you want to do is make sure that you're only contacting one enemy unit. So what I'm saying here is if we are charging the warriors, we're not going to make contact with the seekers if there's any way that these guys can avoid doing it. So when they're moving forward, they're going to have to wheel in some sort of manner where they wheel here to miss those and then come in and make contact. So if there's more than one unit charging, the next rule is to make sure you get as many units to successfully charge as possible. The third rule is you want to try to avoid the charge unit, which would be these warriors here, actually having to move to align to the unit that's charging them. And then the last thing is you want to maximize the number of models on both sides that are in base contact with at least one enemy model. So what I'm saying there with maximizing, let's say we come over here and we do this. You can see I've got some guys on the edge here that are not fighting, and they should be able to fight with at least 6. So I should be coming over here and maximizing so I've only got one guy instead of 2 guys that are out on the fighting. When there's just one unit charging one unit, it's a lot easier. When you start getting multiple units charging in, I'll show you some of the differences that'll be there. All right, so this is a scenario where we have some impassable terrain in the way, and we may not go ahead and get the full amount of maximization on models in base-to-base contact by following all the rules. So what I'm saying here is if these dwarves are now charging the orcs and they come in, our first priority is we're going to want to go ahead and wheel early enough that they can complete and touch the orcs without the orcs having to basically align to them. So we're not going to get quite as many models this way. We're only going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the front of the orcs that would be in contact. Whereas if that rule wasn't in place, let's say that the dwarves came over here, then wheeled, and they made contact. Let's say they did a little bit earlier, so they made contact here, and then these guys closed the gap to them. You would have more models that are in base-to-base contact. So that went out of the order of the rules because the third priority is to avoid this unit from rotating, whereas the fourth priority is to maximize the number of models that are in combat. Let's talk about combined charges, and I'm going to give you 2 scenarios with the same amount of units charging, just in a different way. So first we can see the dwarves are in big trouble. They've somehow gotten themselves surrounded by orcs and goblins, and all of these units are going to charge. Now, the way they're set up, there's no way any of them could fail their charge, so we're not going to roll any dice for that. We're just going to talk about priorities and how we put everything in together. The first thing we want to do is determine where everything is in accordance to which side of the dwarfs they're charging. So you'll see, obviously, the front guys here are going to be in the frontal. When we come over here and we put our line of arc over here, it's very easy to see that the goblins are in the flank of the dwarfs. And if we come over here, we can look at this either way. We can have it on this side, and it's easy to see that the giant is in the rear by going like this. You can even put your marker back here, and you can see again it's the rear. And if we take a look over here, the chariot is also going to be clearly in the rear. So we know that both the giant and the chariot are coming in the rear. Those guys, the goblins, are coming in the flank, and the feral orcs are going into the front. So for our priority number 2, we want to maximize the number of charging units that can make contact. That's not going to be a problem because we're not really bumping anybody out of combat. We just have to make sure that nobody would line up in a way that the other person would stop the charge. So for example, these guys couldn't come in here and block these guys from coming in and maximizing. So now the next thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to try to get as many models in contact as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move these guys first. So they're going to go ahead and just go straight forward. They don't even have to wheel to maximize. And then they're going to go ahead and align and close right here. Now, what happens is you'll see, because they've done that, they've blocked these guys. So we can't do that first, because if we do, we've now caused this unit to not be able to charge, and that means that we're breaking an earlier priority. So we're going to bring them back, and so what we're going to do is we're actually going to bring these guys in. Now, they do want to wheel a little bit, so they're going to wheel here. They're going to come up, they're going to make contact, and then they're going to go ahead and close and align in. Now by doing that, that allows these guys to come up, make contact, and align, and then now they're not blocking them. Now on the back side, You have a lot of different ways you can do this, because once a model is engaged, so this model is engaged by these guys, so he no longer has to be engaged by anybody in the rear. You can if you want to, but you don't have to. And this giant is somebody who we want to get a few attacks on, because giants are going to have more attacks once they've been wounded. So we want the dwarfs to hit the giant as many times as possible, so he can get angry and then swing back at him. So with the giant, we're going to go ahead and wheel him, and we're going to make contact here, and we're going to go ahead and align. And he didn't, again, have to be in contact with this guy. Now, this guy is not in contact with anybody, so he does need to be made contact with, but we can come over here and we can go just edge to edge. And this guy doesn't have to be in contact with him and him, because everybody has already been in base contact with someone. This is something that's a little bit of advanced strategies, but it's something I want you to be aware of, that if you're charging more than one unit into a certain side of another unit, you can really get creative as long as you can make your wheels and your alignments to where sometimes the units that you don't want to have a lot of models in the fight, you can keep those out. I'm going to show you a little different situation with the same units, just in a different format. So now we have the Ed Bashers that are going to be in the front of the dwarves, but we have all three of the other units that are going to be in the flank of the dwarves. It's going to be a little trickier trying to get everybody in, because the first thing we have to do is make sure that all units can make contact, that successfully charge, and these guys are all within enough range that they can make the charge. The next thing we need to do is we need to maximize the number of models. If we maximize the models on the orcs, and we came over here and we did this and we got the most amount of models in, that's going to affect how we can get people over here. So what the orcs are going to have to do is maybe not perfectly maximize, they're going to have to start wheeling, and they need to end up where they're flush with this, so we can get as many models lining up over here as we possibly can. So we are going to lose an orc basically out of the fight here, just because of we need to get everybody in. Now when we start talking over here, we need to make sure that the most amount of the dwarfs are going to be in contact, but we also have to make sure that the most amount of the chargers are going to be in contact. And what that's going to require is all of these goblins that can be in contact need to be in contact, because we're going to have more models here than we would here. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're just going to bring this chariot, and he's going to clip the very corner here. Then we're going to bring in the giant, and he would basically do a quick wheel, line up here, and then a line. All right, and then that's going to allow as many of the goblins as we can get to come in and wheel first. So we're going to wheel them. We need to make it to where they can hit here, and then they're going to align. And we could have got them scooted over just a little bit more to about there. So we've gotten as many goblins as we possibly could. We got the giant, the chariot, and then we got as many orcs as we could without keeping one unit from charging. All right, now I'm going to show you a scenario where you could end up having a impossible charge because everybody ended up making their charge range. So in this case, the dwarfs have backed up, and we've got a lot of orcs and goblins coming at them from the front. Everybody is in their frontal arc. So we've decided to charge with all four of the units. We have the orcs, the goblins, the giant, and the chariot. And we're worried that maybe one of them would fail their charge, so we want to try to get everybody in as possible. But in this case, they all made their charge. Well, it's easy to see that there would be no way for everybody to make it and still line up. If the giant and chariot were farther back so they could do only one wheel and end up by the orcs, then everyone would be able to make the charge. But since they can't clear the goblin unit with one wheel, it's impossible for them to make that charge in that way. Because even if we brought the orcs into the very edge, and then we wheeled these guys, and they came forward to here, best case scenario, the chariot or the giant could barely make it in on the corner. So someone would have to fail a charge. So let's say that we want the chariot to come in. The chariot would come in, and he would line up in the corner, and then the giant would fail a charge. So if the giant had rolled a 3 and a 5, then he would just stumble forward, which would be 5 inches. However, that's going to be closer than staying an inch away. So he would actually just go forward until he's an inch away from this unit, and he would fail his charge. Now, I'd suggest when you're trying to figure out different charge options and how some of them get complicated, go to the rulebook and look at all of their options. They have a lot of diagrams in the rulebook. So it'll really help you just see the different scenarios and how different types of charges would work out. Now I'm going to show you a flee option here, which I'd say in the real 9th Age world, no respectable dwarf is going to flee from some orcs and then an orc boy chariot. But in this case, they are going to choose to flee. So what we're going to do is the Ed Bashers are going to go ahead and charge the dwarfs, and the dwarfs decide that they don't want any part of this, so they're going to flee. And say they roll a 10 on their flee because they roll 2 dice. What we're going to do is we're going to go center to center. The dwarfs are going to turn and go directly away from that. So on the units, if we look at the laser we bring it up, we've got center to center here. This is where the dwarfs are going to turn to face. So they're going to turn around this way, and I'll just make sure that is still looking like center to center, and that's looking pretty close to center to center. And then they're going to go 10 inches forward. So now when we measure this, what you're going to see is closest model to closest model. And if we put this down, it's going to be a little over 14, which means that's going to be a 15-inch charge for the orc boys to complete with the dwarf warriors. So with them moving forward, that means that they need to roll an 11 on 2 dice to catch them. Now, if they were lucky enough to roll an 11 with 2 dice, then they would make contact with the dwarf unit. And then that dwarf unit would just disappear. They would all die because they caught a fleeing unit. But we think that's pretty unlikely that they're going to catch that. The way that it's ended up, first the dwarf warriors were actually being flanked by the chariot, but because they fled, the chariot is now going to be in their rear. And the chariot wants to go ahead and charge them. We know that they're going to flee again because they have to, because they're already fleeing. So if there's a charge reaction, if there's a charge against a fleeing unit, the only reaction is to flee. They might go off the table, or we might catch them with the chariot. But because it's an 11 with just the orc boys, we're going to go ahead and try with the chariot. So the chariot is going to declare a charge. We don't have to measure what the distance is as long as we know it's within his charge range, because the dwarfs are going to go ahead and flee now again. Let's go ahead and see how far they flee. So they flee 11 inches. These are some very fast dwarfs today. So again, we need to go center to center. So if we look at the chariot and the dwarfs, that's the center line. So we're going to go like this on the center line. Now, my camera may not catch this, but I'll tell you that the dwarfs are within about 9 inches of the table edge. They were taking a chance fleeing the first time, going that far, and by fleeing the second time, because they have to, these guys have actually pushed the dwarf warriors off the table, which means they're automatically destroyed. But let's just say that they had changed this dice roll to a 2 and a 1, so they only went 3 inches. Let's go ahead and move them forward 3 inches. Now if we take a look at how far the chariot is from the dwarf unit, the chariot is just under 14 inches from closest to closest. The chariot just needs to roll 14 minus his movement on the dice to complete that. Now, orc-boar chariots are not very fast, but they do move 7, and chariots are normally what we call swift stride, which means they get a maximized roll for their charge. So what they're going to do is they're going to take 3 dice, and they're going to take the highest 2 instead of just rolling 2 dice for their charge. So we know with being 14 inches away and they move 7, we just need to get a 7, and we're going to do that with 3 dice, taking the highest 2. So he's going to go ahead and roll this, and with the highest 2, that's a 9, so the chariot actually catches the dwarfs. Even if we would have only had 2 dice, they actually still would have made this. So what's going to happen is the chariot is going to do a wheel, move forward. As soon as he makes contacts with the dwarfs there, the dwarf unit is then going to go ahead and be destroyed, so we take them off the table. And because the chariot caught a fleeing unit, what he can do is if he passes a leadership test, which I'm going to say is within the general's leadership, and it's a 9, and that's a 10, so he fails. So because he failed the leadership, he can't do anything. But if he would have passed his leadership, the chariot can do a post-combat pivot and be facing any direction that he wants to. So there's one last thing I want to just talk about on the charging. If you have a unit that has more than one movement characteristic in it, then you're going to have to go at that same speed of the slowest model. So for example, we have some Wolf Riders here, which they move 9 inches. And so they would be basically looking at a pretty easy charge on these dwarfs, because if we go 9 inches minus, it looks like this is just over 15, so it'd be a 16. They need a 7 with Swift Stride, so they would need, it's better than average. They get that because they're rolling 3 dice, taking the highest 2, and completing the charge. But let's say that we add to them a hero that's on a spider. The Scuttler Spider is going to be a slower movement than the Wolves. He only moves 7 inches instead of the 9 inches. So in that case, we're going to be too hard to get there, so we're actually going to need a 9 to complete the charge instead of a 7, because he's going to be what we use our base movement off of. So there's going to be a lot of charging options that will come up in your games that I'm just not able to go over here, but hopefully this gives you a good basics of how the charges work. And then on the next video, we're going to talk about the movement phase, which is going to be following the charge phase. Hi YouTube, this is Mike with Dark Wizard Gaming. Thanks so much for watching our How to Play 9th Age video series. Now if you did like the video, please use the like and subscribe feature below here, and feel free to leave any comments. And now if you have questions about how the game works or any rules questions, I would strongly suggest you go to the 9th Age forum and actually post on there. They're going to have a full team, and there's a community there to help you with any rules questions. If you do comment here, I will answer your questions, but it may take a week or two before I get back with you, whereas if you go to the 9th Age forums, you'll get answers right away. So enjoy your 9th Age gaming. Thanks.